Welcome to another episode of Earth is Our Home with Dr. Thomas Blaine. Today we're going to be looking at Earth is Our Home, in which Tom examines the war in Ukraine, part 2. Stay tuned. Welcome to another episode of Earth is Our Home. Dr. Thomas Blaine is an associate professor with the Ohio State University Extension Program, in which he brings a variety of different things to our attention. And today we're going to be looking at part 2, in which he's going to examine the war in Ukraine. Tom, it's always a pleasure talking with you.
It's always a pleasure to come on here and teach Earth is Our Home. We are in part 2 of our examination of the war in Ukraine. In part 1 of the video that we did last week, and we're going to have the link for that down below this one. So for the viewers out there, if you want to see part 1, just go to the link down below this. We talked about the history of Russia and Ukraine, and a little bit about why this war has started. Why did Russia invade Ukraine? There's quite a lot to that. We also talked about my extensive travels in Ukraine. I showed some pictures. Just have it on a little bit of the lighter side, because this is not an uplifting topic when you're talking about a nation in the process of being destroyed and the possibility of nuclear war. So in the next slide, I've got a photograph of me on St. Sophia Square in Kiev. St. Sophia was built by the medieval Russian, Kievan Russian Tsar, Yaroslav the Wise. We talked about him last time, and there I am on the square. That's right in central Kiev. And if you look way back behind me, that's St. Michael's Golden Domed Monastery. Absolutely beautiful place. So in the next slide, I'm gaining entrance into a military academy, Ukrainian military academy, just a few miles from the Russian border. This was in 2016. So the young cadets I met there are now junior officers in the Ukrainian army, probably leading platoons or companies of Ukrainian soldiers in combat against the Russians. There I am at the door to the academy. You see that young man, cadet, looks like he's in a little bit of a hurry. The following photo shows me with 2 young cadets who were on watch in the foyer. They were great hosts. They spoke no English. I don't speak Ukrainian, but we spoke Russian. And like I say, Russian is the language I speak all over Ukraine, because essentially the Russian language is the dominant language in Ukraine, at least as far as my experience goes. But despite the fact that Ukraine has deep roots in Russia and people speak Russian there, make no mistake about it, this school was devoted to developing the military defense of an independent Ukraine. And it's the presence of this school and other military installations that has allowed Ukraine to build an army that can hold off a Soviet assault. Even if these Ukrainian folks are descended from Russian people, speak the Russian language, they do not want to be a part of Russia. They want to be a part of a free and independent Ukraine, and they're willing to fight for it. And there are the 2 young men that were on watch who escorted me. They're probably junior officers now. in the Ukrainian military. This was 6 years ago, and they were wonderful hosts. They really enjoyed talking to the former U.S. Naval Academy midshipman, me, and we had a great conversation, great time there. Okay, in part one, we talked to the history of Russia, Ukraine, that provided a basis for Putin's claim that Ukraine and Russia are really one country. And that gives him a basis, in his mind at least, for why he should try to annex Ukraine. We also discussed how during the post-Cold War era, Russia and Ukraine have drifted apart politically. Both tried out democracy. It's worked pretty well in Ukraine. It hasn't worked in Russia. Putin is an autocrat, a dictator, basically. And Ukraine seeks closer ties with the West as a result of this. They want to be more like Germany, France, Great Britain, and the United States. But the problem is, when you live next door to a military superpower, like Ukraine does, attempting to join a military alliance with another superpower is playing with fire. So imagine how the USA would react if Mexico attempted to join a military alliance with China. And China wanted to put naval bases along the west coast of Mexico. Well, I can tell you right now, the U.S. would not allow this to happen. We have the Monroe Doctrine. We won't allow any forces from outside the Americas to place military installations in the Americas. We saw this in the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago when the U.S. was willing to go to the brink of nuclear war to keep Russian nuclear weapons out of Cuba. Since the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s, you have to ask yourself some questions about why NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, has expanded eastward to include Poland, for example, and to court Ukraine. The purpose of NATO, and I was in the U.S. Navy in the Cold War, the purpose of NATO was to protect Western European nations from the Soviet Union. That's what we were prepared to do. But once the Soviet Union collapsed, then, what's the reason for having NATO? Mikhail Gorbachev even proposed that the West join a military alliance with Russia. Can you imagine if Russia and the U.S. had formed a military alliance? Why did this fail? Why did the world go back down the road of confrontation where we are now? Well, there are some possible reasons. Possibly the Eastern European countries like Poland, the Baltic states, had a genuine distrust of Russia. They just did not want to be a part of the Russian sphere of influence. They looked at the United States as the kind of country they wanted to emulate, and not Russia. And then even Ukraine did. Ukraine's been very friendly to the United States. You could go to Ukraine without even getting a visa, which is why I went there so many times. It's a taste of Russia, Russian culture, without going to Russia itself and having to get a visa and all the obstacles they threw up. But another one, Patrick, another reason that NATO kept expanding east is because of the U.S. arms industry, which wields enormous influence in the U.S., found new markets for their weapon systems in Eastern Europe. replacing Soviet systems with American ones. This is the military industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us about. He warned us that this would happen, that those who make the bombers, the missiles, and all that stuff would try to influence U.S. foreign policy in a way like this. Hey, don't give up NATO, even though the Soviet Union's gone. Push NATO on up. We can make a lot of money selling missile systems to those countries. We just, right now, are passing a $40 billion aid package. That sounds real nice, but it's not what you think it is. Most of that money will wind up right back in the pockets of U.S. arms industry people, leaders who are just going to hand Ukraine not money or anything like that, but weapon systems, missiles, rockets, value at some $40 billion. Either way, Putin's been able to convince the Russian people that the war is just. And despite the fact that there's a lot of history that we talked about that's true, Putin lies to the Russian people about the political realities in Ukraine. I listen to his speeches because I can understand what he's saying. And some of the things he says about Ukraine are just outrageous. Instead of just telling what I told you about Realpolitik, here's Putin on there calling Ukrainian national patriots. He calls them fascists, anti-Semites. I've heard him do it on the speeches. He says they're Nazis. Yet the president of Ukraine is Jewish. I've been to synagogues in Ukraine. It's not fascist. It's not. These are lies that Putin's telling. But he has a sway over the Russian people because they can't get news very easily like we can. It's a closed society. Well, the Russian military then, once he attacked, is proven too weak to win or to annex Ukraine. This is good news, but it's also bad news. You know the good news. But the bad news is that Russia is now in the process of destroying Ukraine. If they can't beat them, they can still pound them into the ground with missiles. They've destroyed about 80% of the buildings in Mariupol, down in the southeast part of Ukraine, near the Black Sea. And they can continue to do this. But as this goes on and Ukraine still doesn't surrender, Putin will continue to pull tools out of his toolbox that include a vast array of nuclear weapons. Will he use them? Well, in addition to the large-sized nuclear weapons that they have, since the late 1990s, Russia has created a lot of small nuclear weapons, battlefield nukes, that they could use in fighting a war like this, which would completely transform the war. Now, I want to tell you the difference between strategic nuclear weapons and tactical nuclear weapons. A strategic weapon is a very large weapon that could destroy a whole city. And you fire a strategic weapon not at those directly engaged in the war, but in the cities and the industrial centers of a country. When we bombed Berlin and Tokyo in World War II, that was strategic bombing. When we fought a battle against the Japanese at Iwo Jima or Okinawa, or when we fought a battle like the Battle of the Bulge against the Germans, this was tactical warfare, fighting on a battlefield. Well, the way the U.S. and the Soviet Union avoided nuclear war was they maintained a nuclear arsenal filled with strategic nuclear weapons that were so powerful that they formed a policy called mutual assured destruction, which means, once we go to nuclear war, we're going to fire a missile at a city that's 50 times the size of the Hiroshima bomb, 50 times. It's going to completely annihilate that city. And because of that, because the Soviets had that arsenal and we had the arsenal, it meant neither side was going to go in that direction. It's called mutually assured destruction, appropriately known perhaps as MAD. But with battlefield nukes, these are nukes that go the other way. They're very small. Many of them are only about a third the size of the Hiroshima bomb. The Russians, once the Cold War ended, the Russians, possibly in anticipation that their army would be as bad as it is now, and it's really bad, not to be able to defeat Ukraine. They've lost at the sea. They've had their ships sunk. They've had their tanks destroyed. Their army's very inept. Perhaps in anticipation of that, they made these battlefield nukes only about a third the size of the Hiroshima bomb. These are nukes you use on the battlefield to destroy, say, an enemy division or an enemy corps or military installation. But the fact that you don't have to jump off the deep end now, you can start with small nukes, means that we're in a very dangerous situation. Now, I want to show you an image. This actually appeared on Russian television. This is what we're talking about happening right now. Russia's now talking openly about actual strategic nuclear war, not just the tactical nukes. And Putin could unleash those. But he could also, well, let me put it this way, they're openly talking about this. So if you look there to the right in the white, it says Kaliningrad, K-A, and then that's an L-I-N, Kaliningrad. That's a place in Western Russia. This graphic shows the time that it would take a strategic nuclear weapon to reach 3 European capitals. The one furthest to the right says Berlin. If you see that funny looking B, that is a B. E, and that looks like a P, that's an R, Berlin. 106 seconds. That's a minute and 46 seconds from firing to the complete annihilation of Berlin. Paris is down there below that and west. You see P, A, and then that P is an R, Paris. 200 seconds. That's 3 minutes and 20 seconds. And then London, 202 seconds. Just 2 seconds more. And, so within just 3.5 minutes or so, you would have 3 Western European capitals completely destroyed. So not only does Russia have the option of tactical nukes, which would escalate by using them on the battlefield against Ukrainian forces, they're openly talking. This was a graphic from Russian television. And it says there, the time that it would take, and that's the RS-28. That's not a PC, that's RS. Remember, this is Cyrillic. So the letter looks like a P as an R, and the letter looks like a C as an S. Sarmat. Pretty scary when you're talking about a major power a nuclear power actually showing something like this, we're in a new realm now. So when I started to do this, I hadn't even seen this. This came out on Russian TV, but I knew I had to talk about this because we really are closer to nuclear war now than we've been at any time since the Cold War when you have open discussion. Like I'm going to close out today. This is me at the park in Nikolaev, Ukraine, back a few years ago. And the sign says, "Let's be friends." There's my contact information. Feel free to contact me if you have questions or want me to address other things. Next time, we are going to talk about what we need to do to prevent this war from escalating, what we need to do to stop it. And I'll just give you a hint. It's diplomacy. The only thing that can prevent war, the war from continuing or escalating, is diplomacy. And I'm going to explain to you why that diplomacy cannot just be between Ukraine and Russia. That won't work. It's got to be diplomacy between the United States and Russia.
You know, we talked about the possibility of a nuclear war. I think a step below that is biological warfare. In your studies, have you seen where Russia is possibly looking at biological warfare first?
Russia, okay, so when you talk about these kind of weapons of mass destruction, there are several. There's biological weapons, there's chemical weapons, but right now, as you can see, Russia's going public. I didn't just make this up. This came off Russian television. And, so Russia itself is talking and threatening nuclear war, not just against Ukraine, but against the allies of Ukraine that are supplying it with the means of fighting the Russians. So they're not really threatening. Yeah, of course, Russia has biological and chemical capabilities. Yes, they do. But no, I don't see those as that likely. I mean, Putin is very vicious and I wouldn't put anything past him. But I'm doing this because I'm taking the evidence that I have that Russia is, out of control here and talking about weapons of mass destruction. This is what they're showing. So this is what I'm showing. But do they have chemical and biological? They sure do. But I think this is probably at the forefront, Patrick.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I know that if Russia were to launch a nuclear war, which, I'm going to stay on the positive side and say it's not going to happen. But if they were, would Russia not be concerned about the retaliation of not only the countries that you mentioned, like France, England, Germany, but also the other NATO countries and United States?
I mean, there's no question if they fired these strategic nuclear weapons, Russia would be destroyed within a matter of hours. We would immediately shower down nuclear weapons on Russia. But Patrick, the problem is, as those weapons are being fired and in the air, we don't have this kind of close time. It's a lot further, although we do have submarines that could fire it quickly. There's no reason why the Russians could not fire back at us. Yeah, we're talking about a doomsday scenario. And that's what is, remember I talked about MAD, mutually assured destruction. That's still in play when it comes to these strategic weapons. Russia knows that if they go this route, they will be destroyed. But the problem is the world may be destroyed because the world can only take so many nuclear blasts until the radioactive fallout creates what's called a nuclear winter, where all that material spreads around the planet, the fallout and so forth, blocks the sun, and we go into a deep freeze. That's called a nuclear winter. And if we start exchanging strategic nuclear weapons between Russia and the US and its allies, I mean, it's just, I can't emphasize, I mean, it really is an existential threat to our species, to Homo sapiens, definitely to our way of life, and possibly to our existence, which again is why I'm doing this on Earth is Our Home. I wouldn't be doing this if this were just a war between two random countries. There's fighting a lot all over the world. But I really don't think we've been this close to nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And yes, knows, and the Russians know that if they do something like this, their existence is over. But unfortunately, in a war like this, again, mutually assured destruction was the name we used back then. There are no winners. There are no winners, but that's why I also wanted to bring out about the tactical nukes, the smaller battlefield nukes, where you start to think maybe you can win if you keep it small. And that's dangerous because once you start firing those, it changes everything. It could very easily escalate into this and a possible extinction event.
Well, let's hope that on your next installment of examining the war in Ukraine, that we can find possible solutions. And I look forward to that program.
Well, I do too. You know, as we're going to talk about, again, the key to ending this is not through military action, even though both sides are pursuing now that. Military action is not going to stop this fighting. We're giving Ukraine a lot of military support right now, but that's just going to prolong the fighting. And what we need is diplomacy.
Hey, we're talking with Dr. Thomas Blaine. He's an associate professor with the Ohio State University Extension Program. Tom, it's always a pleasure, and thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. We'll see you next time.